Clothing is clean, if faded from years of use. He hums softly. He looks up momentarily to see a group of businessmen entering through the revolving doors. The tallest of them walks with an air of importance, his gold watch gleaming under the lobby lights, and his sharp navy blue suit fitting perfectly over his broad shoulders. As he wipes the last streak of water off the polished floor, his back aches from hours of work, but he takes pride in his work and treats it with care. Mr. Collins doesn't slow down as he walks forward with a phone to his ear. His voice is loud and confident as he talks about deals and numbers. He barely notices a janitor kneeling nearby as his pricey leather shoes click against the marble. Then, his foot hits a patch of wet water that hasn't dried yet, and his step falters for a brief moment before he turns sharply toward the elderly man who is still holding the mop. Mr. Collins takes a deep breath to steady himself, and as he looks down at the elderly janitor who is kneeling on the floor, a wave of annoyance passes across his face. He takes a step back and shakes his head as though indignant. "Are you blind, old man?" His voice pierces the lobby like a whip. "Do you even know how much these shoes cost? You almost knocked me down." He raises his foot a little, as though he expects someone to look for damage. "This is unacceptable. You are being paid to perform a basic task, and you are incapable of doing it correctly." The hotel staff behind the front door look at each other, but nobody moves. The guests in the lobby shift uncomfortably, and no one speaks. Mr. Thompson grips the mop handle tightly. His knuckles turn white, but he does not raise his eyes. He has heard worse in his years of work. He swallows and begins to speak, but before he can finish, Mr. Collins moves closer. "This is why people like you stay at the bottom. Useless a waste of space." His voice gets louder. Mr. Collins interrupts him with a wave of his hand as Mr. Thompson lowers his head, inhales deeply, and opens his mouth once more. "Where's your manager? I want you fired. This place has to recruit people who genuinely know what they're doing. I don't have time for this." Throughout the throng, there's a long period of silence. Mr. Thompson is standing, in position and frozen. The mop in his palm feels heavier than before, and the tight silence is broken by a slow, purposeful clap, like a razor slicing through the stillness. The sound is forceful yet serene. Mr. Collins abruptly turned, his face changing from one of rage to one of mild perplexity. A man emerges from a quiet corner of the lobby, his dark hair falling slightly over his forehead, hands carelessly tucked into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, and his face is unmistakably that of Keanu Reeves. The guests and staff follow his gaze. A few others in the crowd whisper in understanding as Mr. Collins blinks his mouth half open, as if his brain is still digesting what is occurring. Others raise their phones, their screens flashing, and begin covertly recording. Keanu pauses a few feet from Mr. Thompson and tilts his head slightly. His eyes are fixed on Mr. Collins, and he speaks steadily, without showing any signs of rage, only quiet disappointment. "Money doesn't make a person nice or cruel. That's a decision. I've met many people in my life, some with more money than they'll ever need, and others who barely have enough to get by." Mr. Collins laughs. "Who exactly do you think you are, and why are you crossing your arms?" Ignoring him, Keanu sits next to Mr. Thompson and puts a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, sir?" he asks in a kind and genuine tone. Mr. Thompson nods slowly and says, "I've been through worse," faking a tiny smile. He has a harsh, tired voice. Keanu looks at him briefly before asking, "How long have you worked here?" 30 years. Mr. Thompson responds, "When I was a young man, I raised my kids on this job and put them through school. My wife is ill and hospital bills are mounting, but I keep going." He pauses and shakes his head, saying that a man does what he must.
The hotel manager gave him an envelope before he departed, which he opens as if today wasn't already bizarre enough. His hands shake as he reads a letter that says your wife's medical bills have been paid for by an unknown donor. The words get hazy as his eyes well up with tears. He is so overtaken with emotion that he holds the letter closely. As his wife puts a hand to her mouth and lets the tears fall down her cheeks, her lips tremble. Mr. Thompson looks up into his heart and lets out a shaky exhale while wiping his face. I'm not sure how he whispers, but I know it was him in that loving, thankful moment. He realizes that genuine prosperity isn't determined by wealth or power, but rather by compassion. and that sometimes the world reminds you that good things still exist when you least expect them to. Keanu nods, his face unreadable. He claims that my mother worked hard too, raising my sister and me by herself while working multiple jobs to put food on the table. I understand what it's like to struggle and to work honestly, just like you do. As the muttering in the lobby gets louder and more guests are listening, some hotel employees look at one another with guilt on their faces for not intervening sooner. Keanu gets up, turns back to face Mr. Collins, and says, "No amount of money makes it okay to treat another human being like they don't matter." His eyes are serene, but there's an obvious passion in them. Uncomfortably, Mr. Collins's confidence in his stand starts to waver. He looks around, realizing that a lot of people are watching, and a bead of sweat forms at his temple. He swallows, but says nothing. Mr. Collins shakes his head and lets out a brief, dry laugh, saying, "This is ridiculous." He straightens his suit as though dismissing the whole thing. The muttering in the throng gets louder. But I don't have time for this crap. A young woman at the entrance gasps and nuzzles her friend, who is Keanu Reeves. She whispers. Her phone is already raised and is recording, and others follow suit after recognizing who is in front of them. In a matter of seconds, numerous cameras are recording the scene. Unfazed by Mr. Collins' dismissal, Keanu steps back toward the janitor's card and, without saying a word, leans against it to pick up the spare mop. The audience watches in stunned silence as he dips it into bucket and wrings it out, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he kneels next to Mr. Thompson and begins mopping the floor himself quietly, falls across the room, and then gradually the quiet changes as a few sporadic claps reverberate through the lobby. A moment later, the applause spreads and both hotel employees and visitors start clapping louder and louder until the sound fills the entire space. Mr. Collins tenses up and looks around. The dozens of eyes are now on him, not in admiration, but in judgment, and his face flushes a deep shade of red. The same people who had previously ignored the situation are now applauding a Hollywood icon for demonstrating the humility that a powerful businessman had failed to display. His fingers tighten into fists at his sides, and he clears his throat, struggling to find his words. His mind races, knowing that he is losing control of the moment, and worse, that it is being filmed. Eventually, he exhales sharply and steps forward. His voice, though forced, sounds quieter than before. "I shouldn't have spoken to you in that manner," he says, looking at Mr. Thompson and squirming uneasily. "I apologize," Mr. Thompson, who is still holding on to his mop, looks up in silent surprise, studies Mr. Collins for a time, and then nods slightly. It takes a strong man to own his mistakes. He says, quietly. Mr. Collins, at a loss for words, swallows and nods back. As the audience gradually thins out and the tension in the foyer fades, the applause now includes praise for Keanu's generosity in the uncommon sight of a man humbled in public. Keanu discreetly ejects a hotel manager, speaking in a forceful yet composed tone. Mr. Thompson claims that after 30 years of employment, he deserves respect rather than humiliation. The management is still in shock after seeing the situation so slowly, of course, but we sincerely thank Mr. Reeves for his assistance. Unsatisfied with words alone, Keanu takes a folded piece of paper out of his jacket pocket and gives it to the manager, which should pay for his wife's medical bills. He advises making sure he receives it, but don't reveal its source. Instead, let him know that wonderful things come to good people. The supervisor's eyes enlarge as he.
When he glances up, the quantity of breath he catches at the check is significantly more than he had anticipated. Keanu has already started to go. Within hours, videos of Keanu washing the floor went viral on social media, with his hands nonchalantly tucked into his pockets. The headlines of the stories: millions of people share the video of Keanu Reeves standing up for a janitor against a rude businessman, reminding everyone that no job is beneath anyone. However, the biggest surprise for Mr. Thompson occurs later that evening at home when he sits next to his wife, holding her fragile hand tenderly. A dim lamp illuminates their tiny living room, and his voice is filled with emotion as he tells her about the day's events, the cruelty he endured, the unexpected intervention, and the way the audience applauded when Keanu Reeves knelt beside him with a mop. His wife shakes her head in shock as she listens with wide eyes. The intervention of a wealthy businessman who degrades a janitor, K. will leave you wondering where you are seeing this movie. Please leave a comment and let us know, and remember to like the video to help us achieve 1,000 subscribers. The grand chandeliers in the opulent Hilton Royale Hotel illuminate the marble floors with a golden glow, and as guests in smart suits and designer gowns pass through the lobby, an old man leans down with a mop in his rumpled hands. The air is filled with the murmur of important conversations. His name is Mr. Thompson, and he has been employed at this hotel longer than the majority of the managers. His